While his single mother worked overtime on New Year's Eve, a young boy spotted flames on a neighbor's balcony. What he did next made his mother collapse in tears when she learned the truth. Isaiah stood barefoot on the cold tile floor of his third-floor apartment in Miami Beach, his 8-year-old frame casting a long shadow against the wall as the evening sun filtered through the balcony windows. The smell of his mom's cooking filled the small space, rice and beans simmering on the stove, though the portion seemed smaller than usual. Through the glass doors, he watched the neighboring high-rises light up one by one as the sky darkened. "Isaiah, baby, can you bring me that bag from the counter?" Rebecca called from her bedroom, her voice muffled by the clothes she was changing into. He grabbed the plastic grocery bag, its contents rustling as he padded down the narrow hallway. The door to his mom's room was half open, and he could see her struggling to button up her blue work vest in front of the mirror. "Here, Mom," he said, holding out the bag. Rebecca turned, her tired eyes softening as she looked at her son. "Thank you, baby." She knelt down to his level, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "Now remember, I'm working late tonight because of New Year's Eve. Mrs. Martinez next door will check on you at 8. Okay?" Isaiah nodded, though his stomach tightened at the thought of another long evening alone. "I know, Mom. I'll be good. I know you will." She pulled him into a tight hug, and he breathed in the familiar scent of her coconut shampoo mixed with fabric softener. "There's dinner in the microwave. Just hit the start button when you're hungry." Through the bedroom window, Isaiah caught a glimpse of the expensive cars pulling into the driveways of the luxury condos across the street. His mom followed his gaze, and he felt her shoulders tense slightly. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you have to work extra again?" Rebecca's hands paused as she gathered her things. "Just for tonight, baby. The store pays double for holiday shifts." She didn't mention the past due notice for the electricity bill that had arrived that morning, the one she'd quickly stuffed into her purse before Isaiah could see it. The sun had almost disappeared now, leaving the room in partial darkness. Rebecca flicked on the bedside lamp, revealing the worn edges of the furniture and the small crack in the mirror, details that seemed more noticeable in the artificial light. "Can I stay up until midnight?" Isaiah asked, following her to the front door. Rebecca checked her watch, frowning. "Not tonight, sweetheart. It's a school night, remember? Even if it's New Year's Eve." She gathered her purse and keys, the metal jangling in the quiet apartment. "But everyone else, Isaiah." Her voice was firm but gentle. "We've talked about this. 8 o'clock bedtime, okay? Mrs. Martinez will make sure." He nodded, shoulders slumping slightly. The neighbor kids would all be up, watching the fireworks from their balconies. He could already hear their excited voices carrying across the courtyard. Rebecca paused at the door, her hand on the knob. "Lock up behind me? Okay. And remember, don't open the door for anyone except Mrs. Martinez," Isaiah finished. They practiced this routine so many times he could recite it in his sleep. "That's my smart boy." She kissed his forehead, then hesitated. "I'm sorry about tonight, baby. Maybe next year we can." "It's okay, Mom," he said quickly, not wanting to see the guilt in her eyes. "I understand." The door closed with a soft click, and Isaiah turned the deadbolt like he'd been taught. Through the peephole, he watched his mom's figure grow smaller as she walked down the hallway, her work shoes echoing on the concrete floor. The apartment felt different when he was alone, bigger somehow, but also more confining. The tick of the wall clock seemed louder, marking each second of the long evening ahead. Outside, the first strings of holiday lights were beginning to twinkle on neighboring balconies. Isaiah walked to the living room windows, pressing his face against the cool glass. 3 years ago, he would have been watching New Year's Eve shows with his dad, both of them making up silly commentary about the performances. The memory hit him suddenly, making his chest tight. The sound of laughter from the building next door drew his attention. A family was setting up chairs on their balcony, a little girl in a party dress twirling with sparklers. Isaiah's reflection in the window showed his white t-shirt and shorts. No special clothes for tonight. He moved to the kitchen, opening the microwave to check his dinner. The plate of rice and beans looked small and lonely, but he knew his mom had probably skipped lunch to make sure he had enough to eat. The thought made him close the door without hitting start. The TV remote sat on the coffee table, promising a distraction, but Isaiah couldn't bring himself to turn it on. Instead, he grabbed his favorite book, a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are that his dad used to read to him, and settled on the floor near the balcony doors. The sky had turned a deep blue now, with traces of orange still lingering on the horizon. Isaiah could see into several neighboring apartments through their illuminated windows. In one, a family was decorating a table with fancy plates. In another, children jumped on a couch while their parents hung streamers. His eyes drifted to the apartment directly across from theirs, where old Mrs. Thompson lived alone. Her balcony was dark tonight, but he usually saw her there in the mornings, watering her plants and waving to passersby. Sometimes, when his mom worked late, he would wave to her from his balcony, and she would smile and wave back. A cool breeze slipped through the slight gap under the balcony door, making Isaiah shiver. He pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them. The book lay forgotten beside him as he watched the night sky darken and more holiday lights blink to life across the city. From somewhere in the distance, early fireworks popped and crackled. Each burst of light illuminated the room briefly, casting strange shadows on the walls. Isaiah checked the clock, barely 7, and already the night felt endless. He thought about his mom, probably standing behind the cash register at the convenience store right now, dealing with last-minute shoppers rushing to buy champagne and party supplies. He wondered if she was thinking about him too, alone in their apartment while other families celebrated together. The sound of a door slamming in the hallway made him jump. Voices and footsteps passed by, more neighbors heading out to parties, he guessed. Isaiah pressed his ear to the front door, listening until the sounds faded away, leaving him in silence again. Back at the balcony, he noticed more movement in the neighboring buildings. People were starting to gather on their balconies, setting up chairs and tables, preparing for the midnight celebration. The contrast between their festive preparations and his quiet apartment made his throat feel tight. Isaiah's attention was drawn to a flicker of movement on Mrs. Thompson's balcony. Something orange caught his eye, small at first but growing. He squinted, pressing closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. What he saw next made his heart skip a beat. There, on the corner of Mrs. Thompson's balcony, a small flame danced near a potted plant, casting an eerie glow against the darkening sky. Isaiah blinked hard, then rubbed his eyes. The flame was still there, growing larger by the second. His heart began to pound against his ribs as he watched an orange tendril reach up and catch the dry leaves of Mrs. Thompson's hanging plant. "No, no, no," he whispered, his breath creating fog circles on the glass. The TV behind him droned on with New Year's Eve coverage, the host's cheerful voice a strange contrast to the scene unfolding before him. Isaiah fumbled for the remote and hit mute, needing to focus on what he was seeing. He pressed his face closer to the window, nose almost touching the glass. The flame had definitely grown bigger. It was now reaching toward the wooden trellis Mrs. Thompson used for her climbing vines. His palms began to sweat. "Mom," he called out automatically, then remembered she wasn't there. The emptiness of the apartment seemed to echo back at him. Isaiah's mind raced to that morning, when he'd seen Mrs. Thompson on her balcony. She'd been wearing her usual flowered house dress, carefully watering each plant. She'd looked tired, moving slower than usual. Had she left something burning out there? A candle, maybe? The flame jumped to another plant, and Isaiah's stomach lurched. This was real. This was happening. He needed to do something, but what? His mom's words rang in his ears. "Don't leave the apartment. Don't open the door for anyone except Mrs. Martinez." He ran to the kitchen, nearly slipping on the tile floor in his socks. The landline phone hung on the wall, just like always, but his hand froze halfway to it. Who would he call? He didn't know Mrs. Thompson's number. He didn't even know her first name. Back at the window, the fire had spread to a third plant. The dry December air had left everything crispy and perfect for burning. Isaiah could almost feel the heat through the glass now, even though he knew that was impossible. Think, he muttered, pressing his fists against his temples. The building's emergency numbers were posted by the front door. Isaiah had walked past them 100 times, but never really looked at them. Now he ran to the list, scanning quickly. Manager, maintenance, security. His eyes landed on the front desk number. The night porter, Mr. Rodriguez, would be there, He always smiled at Isaiah in the mornings and gave him candy sometimes. But would Mr. Rodriguez believe a kid calling about a fire? Isaiah glanced back at the balcony. The flames were definitely bigger now, creating dancing shadows on the neighboring buildings. He could see the orange glow reflected in other windows, but no one else seemed to have noticed yet. Everyone was too busy with their New Year's celebrations. His hands shook as he reached for the phone. What if he was wrong? What if it was just some kind of decoration or controlled flame? His mom would be so disappointed if he caused trouble for nothing. The memory of his dad's voice suddenly filled his head. Better safe than sorry, champ. Always trust your gut. Isaiah grabbed the phone and dialed the front desk number. Each ring seemed to last forever. On the fourth ring, Mr. Rodriguez's familiar voice answered. Good evening, Ocean View Apartments. Mr. Rodriguez? Isaiah's voice came out as a squeak. He cleared his throat and tried again. It's Isaiah from 3B. Isaiah? Is everything okay? Where's your mother? She's at work, but Mr. Rodriguez, there's a fire on Mrs. Thompson's balcony in the building next door. I can see it from our window. There was a pause that felt like years. Are you sure, Iho? This isn't a joke. Isaiah pressed his forehead against the cool wall. I promise it's not a joke. Please, you have to look. The plants are burning, and it's getting bigger. He heard rustling on the other end of the line, then muffled footsteps. Stay on the phone with me, Isaiah. I'm going to check from the lobby windows. Isaiah ran back to his viewing spot, phone cord stretching to its limit. The fire had now consumed most of the plants on one side of the balcony. As he watched, a gust of wind made the flames dance higher. Mr. Rodriguez? Can you see it? More rustling, then a sharp intake of breath. Dios mío. I see it. I'm calling 911 right now. Stay where you are, Isaiah. Don't move. The line went dead. Isaiah stood frozen, still holding the phone, his reflection pale in the window glass. The sound of holiday music and laughter drifted up from the street below, surreal against the orange glow of the growing fire. Minutes stretched like hours. Isaiah's sock-covered feet felt glued to the floor as he watched the flames spread across Mrs. Thompson's balcony. Where was she? Why hadn't she noticed? His throat felt tight with worry. The distant wail of sirens cut through the evening noise. Isaiah's heart jumped. They were coming, but would they get here in time? The fire had reached the ceiling of the balcony now, black smoke curling up into the dark sky. He heard commotion in the hallway outside his apartment. Voices, footsteps, doors opening and closing. The urge to open his door and look was overwhelming, but his mom's words held him back. Stay inside. Keep the door locked. The sirens grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Red and blue lights began to flash against the buildings, creating a disco effect that would have been cool under any other circumstances. Isaiah pressed his face to the window, trying to see the street below, but the angle was wrong. More voices filled the air now, shouting and urgent. The smoke from Mrs. Thompson's balcony had grown thicker, making it harder to see the flames clearly. Isaiah's eyes stung just from watching. His phone rang, making him jump. He ran to answer it, tripping over his own feet in his rush. Hello, Isaiah. His mom's voice was tight with worry. Baby, are you okay? Mr. Rodriguez just called the store. Mom, there's a fire at Mrs. Thompson's. I saw it start and I called Mr. Rodriguez, and now there's firefighters and slow down, Rebecca interrupted. Are you safe? Are you still in the apartment? Yes, I stayed inside like you said. But Mom, what about Mrs. Thompson? I haven't seen her at all. The firefighters will check on her, baby. That's their job. I'm leaving work right now. Mrs. Martinez is coming to stay with you until I get there. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Isaiah? It's Mrs. Martinez. She's here now, Mom, Isaiah said, relief flooding through him. Okay, let her in and stay with her. I'll be there as fast as I can. You did good, baby. You did really good. Isaiah unlocked the door with shaking hands. Mrs. Martinez rushed in, her face worried but kind. She pulled him into a tight hug that smelled like cinnamon and fabric softener. Oh, mi amor, she said, stroking his head. What a brave boy you are. Together, they stood at the window and watched as firefighters worked to contain the blaze. The The flames that had seemed so huge to Isaiah were quickly brought under control, but the acrid smell of smoke had begun to seep through the walls. "Do you think Mrs. Thompson is okay?" Isaiah asked, his voice small. Mrs. Martinez squeezed his shoulder. "We have to pray and hope, Michigan Amore. That's all we can do right now." Through the chaos of flashing lights and shouting voices, Isaiah caught a glimpse of something that made his heart stop. Firefighters carrying a small figure wrapped in blankets out of the building next door. The person seemed to be moving, fighting against the blankets. "That's her," he cried, recognizing Mrs. Thompson's flowered house dress. "They got her out." Mrs. Martinez crossed herself quickly. "Gracias a Dios." Isaiah's legs suddenly felt weak, and he sat down hard on the floor. The adrenaline that had been keeping him going began to fade, leaving him shaky and tired. He could hear more sirens in the distance, more voices in the hallway, more chaos building outside. But all he could think about was Mrs. Thompson, alone in her apartment, not knowing the danger until it was almost too late. If he hadn't been watching, if he hadn't called for help, the hall outside Isaiah's apartment had become a chaos of voices and footsteps. He sat with his back against the cool wall, Mrs. Martinez's arm around his shoulders, as neighbors rushed past their door. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the building, mixed with radio static and urgent commands. "I should go check on my cats," Mrs. Martinez said, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Will you be okay for just a minute?" Isaiah nodded, though his stomach tightened at the thought of being alone again. "I'm fine." As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, he pressed his ear against the wall. Through the thin barrier, he could hear snippets of conversations. "Lucky someone spotted it. Could have spread to the whole floor. Who called it in?" Isaiah's heart pounded. Would they want to talk to him? What would he say? The thought of facing a crowd of adults made his palms sweat. A sharp knock at the door made him jump. "Fire department. Anyone home?" Isaiah froze. His mom's words echoed in his head. Don't open the door for anyone except Mrs. Martinez. But these were firefighters. They were safe, right? "It's okay, Isaiah." Mrs. Martinez's voice called from the hallway. "Open up, mi amor." His hands trembled as he turned the lock. The door swung open to reveal two firefighters in full gear, their faces serious but kind. Behind them, Mrs. Martinez nodded encouragingly. "You Isaiah?" the taller firefighter asked, kneeling down to his level. The name Johnson was stitched on his jacket. "Yes, sir. Mr. Rodriguez tells us you're the one who spotted the fire and called it in. Can you tell us exactly what you saw?" Isaiah's throat felt dry. "I was watching the buildings because—" He paused, not wanting to admit he'd been feeling lonely. "I saw a small flame on Mrs. Thompson's balcony, by her plants. Then it got bigger really fast." Firefighter Johnson nodded, writing in a small notebook. "What time was this?" I'm not sure. The TV was showing the New Year's show, and around 7:15, Mrs. Martinez interrupted. "I remember checking my watch when I heard the sirens." "You did exactly the right thing, calling for help," the second firefighter said. Her nameplate read Chun. "If you'd waited even a few more minutes—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Isaiah understood. His stomach churned. "Is Mrs. Thompson okay?" he asked. The firefighters exchanged glances. "She's being checked by paramedics, but she seems fine. Just a bit shaken up. Looks like she fell asleep with some candles lit on the balcony." A new voice cut through the hallway noise. "Isaiah? Isaiah! Mom!" Rebecca burst through the door, still wearing her work vest, her eyes wild. She dropped to her knees, pulling Isaiah into a tight hug that smelled of convenience store coffee and winter air. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Her hands moved over his face, his arms, checking for injuries that weren't there. "I'm fine, Mom." "Really?" Rebecca looked up at the firefighters, her arms still around Isaiah. "Thank you for checking on him. I came as soon as I could." "Ma'am, your son's actions tonight potentially saved lives," Firefighter Johnson said. "You should be very proud." Isaiah felt his mom's arms tighten around him. "I am," she whispered. "I always am." More commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Through the open door, Isaiah saw paramedics wheeling a stretcher toward the elevator. Mrs. Thompson sat upright on it, looking small and confused, her flowered house dress smudged with soot. Her eyes met Isaiah's for a brief moment before the elevator doors closed. They're taking her to get checked out at the hospital, firefighter Chen explained. Standard procedure for smoke inhalation. But she's alert and talking. Rebecca stood up, keeping one hand on Isaiah's shoulder. Will she be able to go back to her apartment tonight? Not tonight. There's smoke damage that needs to be assessed. The building manager is arranging temporary accommodation for her. Isaiah thought about Mrs. Thompson spending New Year's Eve alone in a strange place. His chest felt tight. We need to finish up here, firefighter Johnson said, but someone from the department might need to contact you tomorrow for a follow-up report. Is that okay? Rebecca nodded, pulling Isaiah closer. Of course. Whatever you need. After the firefighters left, Mrs. Martinez hugged them both and returned to her apartment. The hallway gradually grew quieter as emergency personnel cleared out and neighbors returned to their New Year's Eve celebrations. Inside their apartment, Rebecca locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. You must have been so scared, baby. Isaiah shrugged, trying to act brave. I just did what you always say. If you see something wrong, tell an adult. Come here. She led him to the couch, pulling him close. Tell me everything. From the beginning. So he did. He told her about watching the buildings light up, about seeing the first small flame, about his fear that no one would believe him. As he talked, the events seemed to become more real, and his voice started to shake. What if I hadn't been looking? What if I'd been watching TV instead? What if, show? Rebecca stroked his hair. Don't think about what if. You were looking. You did see it. You took action. That's what matters. Through the window, they could still see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles reflected on nearby buildings. The smell of smoke lingered in the air. Mom? Isaiah's voice was small. Do you think Dad would be proud? Rebecca's hands stilled for a moment. Oh, baby. He'd be so proud he'd be telling everyone he met. Just like I'm going to do. Isaiah felt tears burning behind his eyes. He'd been holding them back all evening, trying to be strong, but now they spilled over. Rebecca rocked him gently like she used to when he was smaller. It's okay to cry, baby. Sometimes being brave is scary. They sat like that for a long time, the sounds of New Year's Eve celebrations drifting in from outside. Finally, Rebecca checked her watch. It's way past your bedtime, she said softly. Can I stay up? Isaiah asked. Just for tonight? Rebecca smiled. Just for tonight? They moved to the balcony doors, watching as the city prepared for midnight. The burned section of Mrs. Thompson's balcony was a dark scar against the building, but the rest of the night sky was beginning to fill with early fireworks. Mom? Isaiah leaned against her side. What happens now? Now? Rebecca kissed the top of his head. Now we thank God you were watching out that window. Now we make sure Mrs. Thompson is okay. Now we remember that sometimes the scariest moments show us how strong we really are. Isaiah nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The events of the evening felt almost dreamlike now, but the lingering smell of smoke reminded him it had all been real. In the distance, crowds began counting down to midnight. Rebecca pulled Isaiah closer as the numbers echoed across the city. 10, 9, 8. Isaiah thought about Mrs. Thompson in the hospital. 7, 6, 5. He wondered if she knew yet that he'd been the one to spot the fire. 4, 3, 2. He hoped she wasn't too scared, alone on New Year's Eve. 1. Happy New Year. The sky exploded with fireworks, but Isaiah barely noticed. His mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow, wondering what would happen next, hoping that somehow everything would be okay. Rebecca seemed to read his thoughts. One day at a time, baby, she whispered. That's all we can do. Isaiah nodded, watching the colors burst against the dark sky. One day at a time. He could do that. After tonight, he felt like maybe he could do anything. The first hours of the new year brought no rest for Isaiah. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames dancing on Mrs. Thompson's balcony. The sound of sirens still echoed in his ears, even though the emergency vehicles had long since departed. Try to sleep, baby, Rebecca said, running her fingers through his hair. They'd moved to his bedroom, but sleep seemed impossible. I can't. Isaiah sat up in bed, his Spider-Man sheets tangled around his legs. Can we check on Mrs. Thompson? Rebecca checked her phone for the 100th time. The hospital won't give out information to non-family members, remember? But Mr. Rodriguez said he'd call as soon as he heard anything. A sudden burst of late fireworks made them both jump. Through his bedroom window, Isaiah could see the scorched corner of Mrs. Thompson's balcony, black against the night sky. "What if she's all alone?" he asked. Rebecca sat on the edge of his bed. "The nurses will take good care of her. And tomorrow," she glanced at the clock, which read 2:15 a.m. "Well, later today, we'll find out how to contact her." Isaiah picked at a loose thread on his pillowcase. "Mom, why doesn't she have any family?" "We don't know that she doesn't, baby. Maybe they're just far away, like Dad is now." Rebecca's hand stilled for a moment. "That's different. Your dad." She took a deep breath. "Your dad would be right here, if he could be." The sound of voices in the hallway drew their attention. Isaiah scrambled out of bed and pressed his ear to the door. "Sounds like the fire inspector," Rebecca said, joining him. "They're probably doing their final check. Should we tell them about the candles? The firefighters already know, remember?" Mrs. Thompson told them herself. Isaiah nodded, but his mind was racing. What if she gets in trouble? What if they don't let her come back? "Hey?" Rebecca turned him to face her. "That's not going to happen. It was an accident. Everyone knows that." More voices passed by their door, then faded away. The building settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by occasional fireworks and distant celebrations. "Try to lie down again," Rebecca suggested. "Even if you can't sleep." Isaiah crawled back into bed, but his eyes remained wide open. "Can you tell me about when you met Dad?" Rebecca smiled softly. "Again? You've heard this story so many times. Please? The part about the grocery store?" She settled next to him, her back against the headboard. "Well, I was working as a cashier, different store back then, and this tall man comes in soaking wet because it was raining." Isaiah let her voice wash over him. The familiar story, comforting even as his mind kept drifting to Mrs. Thompson. He pictured her in a hospital bed, maybe looking out a window at the same fireworks he could see. The ringing of Rebecca's phone made them both start. "Hello." She sat up straighter. "Yes, Mr. Rodriguez?" "She is?" "Oh, thank God. Yes, we're still up. Of course. Thank you for letting us know." Isaiah held his breath until she hung up. "Mrs. Thompson is back from the hospital," Rebecca announced. "They checked her thoroughly, and she's fine. Just a little smoke inhalation." The building manager got her a room at the extended stay hotel around the corner until her apartment can be cleaned. Relief flooded through Isaiah. "Can we visit her?" "Not tonight, baby, but tomorrow, if she's feeling up to it." Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text. "Actually, Mr. Rodriguez says she's asking about you. She wants to know who spotted the fire." Isaiah's stomach did a flip. "Did you tell her it was me?" "Mr. Rodriguez did. He says she started crying when she found out." "Crying? Why? Is she mad?" Rebecca pulled him close. "No, baby. Those were happy tears. Grateful tears." Another text came through. Rebecca read it and smiled. "She wants to meet you properly tomorrow. Mr. Rodriguez gave her my number if that's okay." Isaiah nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The night crept on, fireworks gradually fading into silence. Around 4 in the morning, exhaustion finally won out, and Isaiah drifted off to sleep. His dreams were a mix of flames and flowers, sirens and silence. He woke to the sound of his mom talking quietly on the phone in the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through his window, making patterns on his wall. For a moment, the events of the previous night felt like a dream. Then he smelled the lingering scent of smoke in the air, and everything came rushing back. "Baby, you up?" Rebecca appeared in his doorway. That was Mrs. Thompson on the phone. Isaiah sat up quickly. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. She wants to know if we can visit her at the hotel this afternoon. Around 2? "Yes." Isaiah threw off his covers. "Can we bring her something? Like cookies or—" "Already thought of that. Mrs. Martinez is making her famous tres leches cake to take over." The next few hours crawled by. Isaiah couldn't focus on TV or books or any of his usual activities. He kept going to the window, looking at Mrs. Thompson's damaged balcony in the harsh light of day. Finally, at 1:45, Rebecca announced it was time to go. Isaiah had changed his shirt 3 times, wanting to look nice, but not too fancy. The extended stay hotel was only 2 blocks away, but the walk felt longer. Isaiah held the cake container carefully, watching his steps to make sure he didn't trip. "Remember," Rebecca said as they entered the hotel lobby, "Mrs. Thompson is probably still tired, so we won't stay too long." They took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Room 312. Isaiah's heart pounded as Rebecca knocked. Coming, a voice called from inside. There were footsteps, then the door opened. Mrs. Thompson stood there in a fresh flowered house dress, her white hair neatly combed. She looked smaller somehow, without her usual backdrop of plants and patio furniture. Her eyes were red-rimmed but bright. "Oh," she said softly, looking down at Isaiah. "Oh, my dear boy." Before he knew what was happening, she had pulled him into a gentle hug, careful not to disturb the cake he was holding. She smelled like hotel soap and something floral, not like smoke at all. Come in," she said, wiping her eyes. "I've been waiting all morning to thank you properly." The hotel room was small but neat, with a kitchenette and a sitting area. On the table, Isaiah noticed a familiar plant, one that must have been inside when the fire started. "Would you like some tea?" Mrs. Thompson asked, already moving to the kitchenette. "I always say important conversations need tea." "Yes, please," Rebecca answered for both of them. "And we brought you cake. From Mrs. Martinez." "Oh, how lovely. She's such a dear." Mrs. Thompson busied herself with cups and saucers. Her hand shook slightly as she poured the tea. They sat around the small table, the cake served on paper plates from the hotel. For a moment, no one spoke. "Isaiah," Mrs. Thompson finally said, "do you know what you did last night?" He swallowed hard. I saw the fire and called Mr. Rodriguez. You saved my life." Her voice was firm. "I had fallen asleep reading on my chair. The candles, I never should have left them burning. If you hadn't spotted the fire when you did." She trailed off, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "How did you know to look?" she asked. "What made you notice?" Isaiah glanced at his mom before answering. "I always look at your balcony. Because sometimes when Mom works late, I see you out there, and you wave to me. It makes me feel less alone." Mrs. Thompson's breath caught. Rebecca reached for Isaiah's hand under the table. "All this time," Mrs. Thompson said quietly, "I thought I was the one who needed those waves. Those little moments of connection. But you needed them too, didn't you?" Isaiah nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Well," she straightened up, clearly trying to lighten the mood, "it seems God put us in view of each other for a reason. Though I could have done with less drama in the revelation." That made Isaiah smile just a little. "When can you go back to your apartment?" Rebecca asked. "They're cleaning it now. Should be ready in a few days." Mrs. Thompson sipped her tea. "The balcony will take longer to repair, of course. Most of my plants—" She paused. "Well, plants can be replaced. We could help you get new ones," Isaiah offered eagerly. "I'm good at carrying stuff." Mrs. Thompson's eyes sparkled. "Are you now? Well, I might just take you up on that offer." She turned to Rebecca. "If it's all right with your mother, of course." "Of course," Rebecca said softly. "We'd be happy to help." They talked for another hour, learning more about each other in those moments than they had in years of being neighbors. Mrs. Thompson told stories about growing up in Georgia, about moving to Miami Beach 30 years ago with her late husband, about her life before it intersected so dramatically with theirs. When it was time to leave, she hugged them both again. "Isaiah," she said, kneeling to his level despite her age, "I want you to remember something. What you did, seeing someone in trouble and taking action, that's not just brave. That's what makes the world better. One person paying attention, caring enough to act. Promise me you'll never lose that." "I promise," he whispered. As they walked home, Isaiah felt different. Lighter somehow, but also more aware. He noticed things he usually missed, the way sunlight hit windows, the sound of children playing in a courtyard, the smell of someone's Sunday cooking. "You okay?" Rebecca asked, squeezing his hand. "Yeah." He looked up at her. "Mom, I think I understand now." "Understand what, baby?" "What you always say about God putting people in our path for a reason. About how we're all connected." Rebecca stopped walking, turning to face him. "And what do you think about that?" Isaiah thought about Mrs. Thompson's waves from her balcony, about lonely evenings made less lonely by those small gestures. "I think," he said slowly. Sometimes we help people without even knowing we're doing it. And sometimes we need to do more than just wave. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. When did you get so wise, baby? I learned from you, he said simply. They walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, both lost in thought. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air around their building, but now it felt less like a reminder of danger and more like a marker of change. Something had shifted, not just in their lives, but in the space between buildings, in the way neighbors saw each other, in the invisible threads that connected their small community. And Isaiah, walking hand in hand with his mother under the Miami Beach sun, felt the full weight of that change, not as a burden, but as a gift. The next morning, Isaiah woke to the sound of voices outside his window. He jumped out of bed and rushed to look. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance of Mrs. Thompson's building, pointing up at her damaged balcony. 2 news vans were parked on the street. "Mom," he called out, "there's people with cameras." Rebecca appeared in his doorway, already dressed for work in her blue vest. "I know, baby. Mr. Rodriguez called to warn us." The story made the local news. Isaiah's stomach tightened. "Did they say my name?" "No, they just mentioned an observant young neighbor." "But—" She sat on his bed, patting the space next to her. "Mrs. Thompson called earlier. The reporters want to talk to her, and she'd like us to be there. Only if you're comfortable with it." Isaiah chewed his lip. "Will I have to talk on TV?" "Not if you don't want to. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with." He looked out the window again. More people had gathered, including some kids from his building. They were pointing up at Mrs. Thompson's balcony, then at his. "When?" "This afternoon. I already called work and took the day off." She smoothed his bedhead hair. "We can have breakfast first. Think about it." In the kitchen, Rebecca made pancakes, a rare treat usually reserved for weekends. The smell of butter and syrup almost masked the lingering scent of smoke that still hung in the air. "Mom?" Isaiah pushed a piece of pancake around his plate. "What if I say something wrong? On TV?" Rebecca set down her coffee cup. "There's no wrong thing to say, baby. Just tell the truth, like you always do." The doorbell rang, making them both jump. Rebecca checked the peephole before opening it. "Mrs. Martinez, come in." Their neighbor bustled in, carrying a paper bag that smelled like fresh bread. "Have you seen the news? Channel 7 did a whole segment this morning." She pulled out her phone, quickly finding the video. Isaiah leaned in to watch. The reporter stood in front of their building, gesturing up at Mrs. Thompson's balcony. In what could have been a tragic start to the new year, quick thinking by a young resident prevented disaster. Images of the fire damage flashed across the screen, followed by interviews with firefighters and other neighbors. The actions of this young hero remind us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is pay attention to those around us, the reporter concluded. Isaiah felt his face grow hot. "They call me a hero." Mrs. Martinez squeezed his shoulder. "Because you are, mi amor. I just saw the fire," he mumbled. "Anyone would have called for help." "But they didn't," Rebecca said quietly. "You did?" The morning passed in a blur of phone calls and visitors. Neighbors Isaiah had barely spoken to before stopped by to shake his hand or pat his head. Someone brought cookies. Someone else brought a card. Around noon, Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text. "Mrs. Thompson's ready whenever we are." Isaiah changed his shirt 3 times before settling on his favorite blue one, the one his dad had given him last Christmas. His hands shook as he tried to button it. "Need help?" Rebecca asked from the doorway. He nodded, letting her fix the buttons. "Did you tell Dad about what happened?" Rebecca's hands stilled for a moment. "I visited his grave this morning before you woke up. Told him everything." She smiled softly. "He always said you had his eyes. Always watching, always noticing things others missed." The walk to Mrs. Thompson's hotel felt longer than yesterday. More people were outside now, enjoying the warm January day. Some pointed and whispered as they passed. In the hotel lobby, a reporter and cameraman were setting up equipment. Mrs. Thompson sat in an armchair nearby, wearing a fresh flowered dress and looking more like herself. "There's my hero," she called out. Opening her arms, Isaiah hugged her carefully, noticing how fragile she felt. "Are you feeling better?" "Much better, dear." Though I miss my morning coffee on the balcony. She turned to Rebecca. Thank you both for doing this. I know it's a lot to ask. The reporter, a kind-faced woman named Maria, approached them. We can do the interview right here, if you're comfortable. Just a few questions about what happened. They arranged themselves on the hotel lobby couch, Mrs. Thompson in the middle, Isaiah and Rebecca on either side. The camera's red light blinked on. Mrs. Thompson, Maria began, take us through that night. What do you remember? I'd been reading on my balcony chair. Mrs. Thompson's voice was steady. I had lit some candles because the power was flickering. I must have dozed off. She described waking up to firefighters pounding on her door, the smoke, the confusion. Her hand found Isaiah's as she spoke. And Isaiah, Maria turned to him. What made you look out your window at that exact moment? Isaiah swallowed hard. I always look at Mrs. Thompson's balcony. She waves to me sometimes when I'm alone after school. Makes me feel better. He felt Mrs. Thompson's hand tighten on his. Such a simple connection, Maria said softly. But it led to something extraordinary. There's nothing extraordinary about caring, Mrs. Thompson interrupted. What's extraordinary is that this young man acted on that care. How many of us see things every day and do nothing? The interview continued, but Isaiah barely heard the questions. He was thinking about what Mrs. Thompson had said, about seeing things and doing nothing. Finally, Maria turned off the camera. Thank you all. This will air on tonight's news. As the crew packed up their equipment, Mrs. Thompson turned to Rebecca. Would you both join me for lunch? There's something I'd like to discuss. They went up to her hotel room, where she'd ordered room service sandwiches. Isaiah noticed she'd added more plants to the windowsill, small ones in bright pots. Rebecca, Mrs. Thompson said once they were settled. I understand you work at the convenience store on Collins Avenue? Rebecca nodded, wiping mayonnaise from Isaiah's chin. For about 3 years now. What would you say to a change? Rebecca's hand stilled. I'm sorry. I've been thinking, Mrs. Thompson set down her teacup. I'm not as young as I used to be. This incident has made that very clear. I could use some help managing my affairs, running errands, keeping my calendar, a personal assistant, if you will. Isaiah watched his mother's face carefully. Mrs. Thompson, Rebecca hesitated. That's very kind, but I don't have any experience as a personal assistant. You have experience managing a household on a tight budget. Experience raising a remarkable young man. Experience handling difficult situations with grace. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. And most importantly, you have a son who sees what others miss. I'd say that's exactly the kind of experience I need. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. The salary would be better than the store, of course. And the hours more flexible. No more late nights away from Isaiah. Isaiah's heart began to race. No more lonely evenings? No more microwave dinners alone? I need to give notice at the store, Rebecca said slowly. And learn what you need. Is that a yes? Mrs. Thompson's face lit up. Rebecca looked at Isaiah, who was practically bouncing in his seat. It's a yes. Mrs. Thompson clapped her hands together. Wonderful. We can work out the details over the next few days, while my apartment is being repaired. Speaking of that, Isaiah piped up, when can we help you get new plants? The adults laughed, breaking the emotional tension in the room. Soon, dear. Very soon. Mrs. Thompson's eyes twinkled. In fact, I'll need an expert opinion on which ones to choose. Someone with a good eye for detail. Isaiah grinned. I know lots about plants. I read about them in school. Perfect. You could be my official plant consultant. She turned back to Rebecca. We can start next week, if that works for you. Give you time to wrap things up at the store. Rebecca nodded, still looking slightly dazed. Yes, next week would be. Yes. They spent the next hour talking about plans and possibilities. Isaiah watched his mother's face grow more animated as Mrs. Thompson described the job. Managing appointments, helping with correspondence, organizing household matters. And of course, Mrs. Thompson added casually, I'll need someone to water the new plants when they come. Someone trustworthy. Isaiah sat up straighter. I can do that. I was hoping you'd say that. When they finally left the hotel, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the street. Isaiah held his mother's hand as they walked home, swinging their arms between them. Are you happy, Mom? Rebecca looked down at him, her eyes bright. Yes, baby. I'm very happy. She squeezed his hand. You know what your father used to say about doors? When God closes one, he opens another, Isaiah recited. Well, sometimes he uses a very special little boy to point out which door needs opening. Isaiah thought about that as they walked. About doors closing and opening. About fires and flowers and fresh starts. Mom, I think he chose his words carefully. I think maybe the fire was scary, but good things came from it. Is that wrong to say? Rebecca stopped walking, kneeling down to his level right there on the sidewalk. No, baby, that's not wrong. Sometimes the scariest moments in life lead us exactly where we need to be. She touched his cheek softly. We just have to be brave enough to walk through those doors when they open. Above them, the Miami Beach sky was turning orange and pink, another day drawing to a close. But for Isaiah, everything felt like a beginning. The next few days brought a whirlwind of changes. Rebecca gave her notice at the convenience store, while Mrs. Thompson's apartment underwent repairs. Isaiah found himself in the middle of it all, watching his small world transform piece by piece. How do these look? He asked, arranging a row of small potted herbs on the hotel room windowsill. Mrs. Thompson had sent them shopping for starter plants, something to brighten up the temporary space. Mrs. Thompson adjusted her reading glasses, examining his work. Perfect alignment. You have quite an eye for detail, young man. The door opened as Rebecca returned from her last shift at the store, still wearing her blue vest. Her eyes were red, but she was smiling. How did it go? Mrs. Thompson asked. Good. Hard, but good. Rebecca set her vest on a chair. Mr. Patel gave me a reference letter and a gift card. Said I was his best employee. Isaiah hugged her around the waist, breathing in the familiar store smell one last time. Did you cry? Maybe a little? She ruffled his hair. Change is hard sometimes, even when it's good change. Mrs. Thompson nodded knowingly. Speaking of change, the building manager called. My apartment will be ready tomorrow. Really? Isaiah perked up. Can we help you move back? That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. I'll need my expert plant consultant to supervise the balcony restoration. The next morning, they met the building maintenance crew at Mrs. Thompson's apartment. The smell of smoke was gone, replaced by fresh paint and cleaning products. The balcony had been cleared and repaired, its wooden surfaces stripped and refinished. It looks so empty, Isaiah said, stepping out onto the clean boards. Not for long, Mrs. Thompson handed him a notebook and pen. I need you to help me plan where everything should go. Make a list of what plants we'll need. While Isaiah sketched out his vision for the balcony, Rebecca and Mrs. Thompson went through the apartment, making notes about what needed replacing or cleaning. The insurance company was very generous, Mrs. Thompson said. But some things can't be replaced. She picked up a smoke-damaged photo frame, wiping it carefully with her sleeve. Isaiah looked up from his notebook. Is that your husband? Yes. She held out the frame. His name was George. He loved gardening too. The photo showed a tall man with kind eyes, standing proudly next to a rose bush. Isaiah studied it carefully. He looks nice, he said finally. He was very nice. Mrs. Thompson's voice grew soft. We never had children of our own, but he always said our plants were our babies. Rebecca touched her shoulder gently. We'll help you make the balcony beautiful again. They spent the morning working out a schedule for Rebecca's new duties. Isaiah sat at the kitchen counter, half listening as they discussed appointments, errands, and household management. And of course, Mrs. Thompson added, we'll need to arrange things so you can be home when Isaiah gets out of school. Isaiah's head snapped up. Really? Of course, dear. No more long evenings alone. Mrs. Thompson smiled. Unless you'll miss your independence? He shook his head quickly. No. I like being trusted to stay alone, but it's better to have Mom home, Mrs. Thompson finished. I remember how that feels. After lunch, they drove to the garden center in Mrs. Thompson's car. Isaiah had never seen so many plants in one place. The air was thick with the smell of soil and growing things. Now remember, Mrs. Thompson said, handing him a cart, we need plants that will do well in partial sun. And nothing too delicate. The ocean breeze can be harsh. Isaiah nodded seriously, consulting his notebook. I made a list. Bougainvillea for color, jasmine for smell, and herbs for cooking. The garden center staff helped them choose healthy specimens, offering advice about care and feeding. Isaiah absorbed every detail, asking questions about watering schedules and pruning techniques. "You've got quite a gardener there," one employee said to Mrs. Thompson. "Yes, I do." She beamed at Isaiah. "My official plant consultant." They filled the cart with plants of all sizes, trailing vines, flowering shrubs, sturdy herbs, and terracotta pots. Rebecca followed behind, carrying bags of soil and fertilizer. "Are you sure this isn't too much?" she asked as they loaded the car. Mrs. Thompson waved away her concern. "George always said a garden couldn't have too many plants. Just too little love." Back at the apartment, they worked together to arrange the new plants. Isaiah directed traffic, consulting his notebook frequently. "The jasmine should go here," he pointed, "so you can smell it when you're having coffee." "And the herbs?" Mrs. Thompson asked. "By the door, so they're easy to reach when you're cooking." Rebecca watched them work, smiling at their serious discussions about plant placement. Her son, usually so quiet and reserved, was coming alive in this new role. As the sun began to set, they stood back to admire their work. The balcony looked different from before, not better or worse, just new. Like everything else in their lives lately. "Perfect," Mrs. Thompson declared. "Now who's hungry?" They ordered pizza and ate it picnic style on the balcony, surrounded by their day's work. The ocean breeze carried the scent of new plants and possibilities. "Isaiah," Mrs. Thompson said between bites, "would you like to come over every day after school? Help me with the plants while your mother works?" Isaiah looked at Rebecca, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, please." He paused. "But what about your nap time? Mom says older people need afternoon naps." Mrs. Thompson laughed. "I think I've had quite enough of napping on the balcony. Don't you?" As they cleaned up the pizza boxes, Isaiah noticed Mrs. Thompson watching him with an odd expression. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing's wrong, dear. I was just thinking." She sat down in her favorite chair. "You know, I used to worry about getting older, about being alone. But sometimes life has a way of sending us exactly what we need, even if it comes in unexpected ways." Rebecca touched her shoulder. "We were all a little lonely, weren't we? And now we're not," Isaiah said simply. That night, as they walked back to their apartment, Isaiah noticed his mom humming, something she hadn't done since his dad died. "Happy?" he asked. "Very." She squeezed his hand. "You know what I was thinking?" "What?" "Maybe we could put some plants on our balcony, too. Nothing fancy, just a few small ones." Isaiah grinned. "I know exactly what would work. We get morning sun, so maybe some—" "Hold on there, plant expert." Rebecca laughed. "Let's start small. 1 or 2 to practice with." They reached their apartment, which felt different somehow, less like a place they retreated to and more like part of something bigger. "Mom?" Isaiah asked as she unlocked the door. "Do you think Dad would like Mrs. Thompson?" Rebecca thought for a moment. "I think he'd love her. And he'd be so proud of how you've helped her. Because I saw the fire? Not just that." She knelt down to his level. "Because you saw a lonely person and found a way to make her less lonely. That's what your father was best at. Seeing people, really seeing them." Isaiah thought about that as he got ready for bed. About seeing people, about loneliness, about how sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes. From his window, he could see Mrs. Thompson's balcony, now filled with new life. A small solar light glowed among the plants, like a beacon. "Good night," he whispered to the light, to Mrs. Thompson, to his dad somewhere above, to all the unknown possibilities stretching out before them. The light seemed to twinkle in response, as if saying that sometimes the best stories start with someone simply paying attention. Rebecca's first official day as Mrs. Thompson's assistant started early. Isaiah watched his mom rush around their apartment, checking her notebook and straightening her new blouse. Navy blue, bought specially for the job. "Do I look professional enough?" she asked, smoothing invisible wrinkles. "You look perfect," Isaiah said, finishing his cereal. "Can I come over after school?" "Homework first," Rebecca reminded him. "Then you can help Mrs. Thompson with the plants." The morning walk to school felt different. No more rushing because his mom had to catch the early bus to the store. No more quick goodbyes at the corner. "This is nice," Isaiah said, swinging their joined hands. "What is—" "Walking together. Like we used to, before." He didn't finish the sentence, but Rebecca squeezed his hand. They both knew he meant before his dad died, when mornings were slower and fuller. At the school gate, Rebecca knelt to straighten his collar. "Mrs. Martinez will pick you up today, okay? I have to take Mrs. Thompson to a doctor's appointment." "Is she sick?" Isaiah's forehead wrinkled with worry. "No, baby. Just a regular checkup after the fire. Standard procedure." The school day crawled by. Isaiah's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, asked him to share the fire story with the class during morning circle. His classmates listened with wide eyes. "Were you scared?" Tommy Martinez asked. Isaiah thought about it. "Not really. Just worried about Mrs. Thompson." "My mom says you're a hero," Sarachin announced. "I'm not," Isaiah mumbled, face hot. "I just saw something and told somebody." Ms. Rodriguez smiled. "Sometimes that's exactly what being a hero means. Paying attention and taking action." After school, Mrs. Martinez walked him home, chattering about neighborhood gossip. But instead of going to his apartment, they went straight to Mrs. Thompson's. The apartment door was open. Inside, Isaiah heard his mom's voice reading something out loud. "Appointment with Dr. Stevens on Thursday at 2 p.m. He found them in the living room, Rebecca sitting with a calendar while Mrs. Thompson sorted through papers. "There's my favorite gardener." Mrs. Thompson brightened. "The jasmine is looking droopy. Would you mind taking a look?" Isaiah dropped his backpack and hurried to the balcony. The jasmine did look thirsty, its leaves slightly wilted in the afternoon heat. "It needs water," he called back, "and maybe some shade until evening. You see?" Mrs. Thompson said to Rebecca. "What would I do without my expert?" Isaiah filled the watering can, carefully measuring the amount like they'd learned at the garden center. As he worked, he heard the adults talking inside. "The doctor says everything looks good," Mrs. Thompson was saying. "Lungs are clear, no lasting damage from the smoke." "Thank God," Rebecca replied. "Isaiah was worried when I mentioned the appointment. That boy worries about everyone but himself, just like his father." Isaiah moved the jasmine pot into partial shade, then checked the other plants. The herbs were thriving, already providing fresh seasonings for Mrs. Thompson's cooking. The bougainvillea was budding, promising bright colors soon. "Homework time," Rebecca called from inside. "Can I do it out here?" Isaiah asked. "Please." "As long as you actually do it." He settled at the small balcony table, textbooks spread out beside the potted herbs. The ocean breeze carried salt and the smell of growing things. Inside, he could hear his mom and Mrs. Thompson working, papers shuffling, quiet discussions about appointments and schedules. It felt right somehow, like pieces fitting together. The afternoon passed peacefully. Isaiah finished his math homework, helped Mrs. Thompson water the remaining plants, and watched his mom organize a filing system for medical records. "I ordered Chinese food for dinner," Mrs. Thompson announced around 6. "I hope everyone likes egg rolls." They ate at her dining room table, passing containers family style. Isaiah noticed his mom looked more relaxed than she had in years. "How was your first day?" he asked between bites of fried rice. Rebecca smiled. "Good. Different. No angry customers, no heavy lifting, no midnight shifts." "And how was school?" Mrs. Thompson asked Isaiah. "Did you tell your friends about our garden project?" "Sort of. They wanted to hear about the fire instead." Mrs. Thompson's face softened. "That must get tiresome, always being asked about it." Isaiah shrugged. "I don't mind, but I like talking about the plants better." After dinner, Mrs. Thompson brought out a surprise. A new gardening book, filled with information about tropical plants. "I thought we could study it together," she said. "Learn what else might work on the balcony." Isaiah's eyes lit up as he flipped through the glossy pages. "Look, Mom, they have a whole chapter on night-blooming flowers. Perfect for our night owl," Rebecca teased. They spent the evening planning future additions to the garden. Isaiah made lists in his notebook while the adults discussed practical matters like water drainage and wind protection. "We could hang bamboo screens," Mrs. Thompson suggested. "Create some shelter for more delicate plants. And maybe string lights?" Isaiah asked hopefully. "To see the plants at night?" "Lights would be lovely," Mrs. Thompson agreed. "We could sit out here in the evenings." Rebecca checked her watch reluctantly. "Speaking of evenings, it's getting late." Isaiah gathered his school things slowly, not wanting the day to end. Everything felt so right here, the plants, the conversation, the way his mom smiled more. "Same time tomorrow?" Mrs. Thompson asked as they prepared to leave. Same time, Rebecca confirmed. I have your medication schedule all set up, and tomorrow we tackle the insurance paperwork. At their apartment door, Isaiah turned to his mom. Can we get some plans for a balcony this weekend? We'll see. But her smile said yes. Inside, as Isaiah got ready for bed, he heard his mom on the phone in the kitchen. He's so happy, Marcus, she was saying. Marcus was his dad's best friend, who checked on them regularly. We both are. It's like waking up from a long sleep. Isaiah thought about that as he lay in bed. About waking up, about changes, about how life could surprise you. From his window, he could see Mrs. Thompson's balcony. The small solar lights they'd installed twinkled among the plants. A shadow moved behind the glass doors. Mrs. Thompson doing her evening routine. Just 3 weeks ago, he'd watched flames dance in that same spot. Now new life grew there, and not just plants. His mom appeared in his doorway. Penny, for your thoughts? I was thinking about the fire, he said. About how scared I was. She sat on his bed. Natural to be scared in scary situations. But also, he searched for the right words. It's like the fire burned away something. The sad things. The lonely things. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. That's pretty deep, baby. Is it okay? He asked. To think good things came from something bad. More than okay. She smoothed his hair. It's wise. Sometimes the hardest moments lead us to the best places. Through the window, the lights on Mrs. Thompson's balcony continued to twinkle. Isaiah thought about the new plants growing there, about his mom's lighter step, about the way Mrs. Thompson's eyes crinkled when she smiled now. Mom, I think Dad would be happy. About everything. Rebecca's hand stilled on his hair. I think so too, baby. I really do. Later, after his mom had gone to bed, Isaiah got up to get a drink of water. Through the kitchen window, he could still see Mrs. Thompson's balcony lights. A memory surfaced, his dad teaching him about stars, saying how they helped sailors find their way home. Maybe these new lights were like that, Isaiah thought. Not stars exactly, but signals of home, of belonging, of the right path forward. He went back to bed feeling full of possibilities, like the seeds they'd planted on the balcony. Small now, but growing towards something beautiful. 1 month after the fire, Isaiah stood on Mrs. Thompson's balcony, misting the plants with a spray bottle. The morning sun caught the water droplets, creating tiny rainbows among the leaves. The transformation of the space amazed him daily. Where once there had been destruction, now life flourished. How's everything looking out there? Mrs. Thompson called from inside. The jasmine's getting bigger, Isaiah reported. And look, the bougainvillea has new flowers. She joined him on the balcony, moving slower than usual. The morning air was cool, carrying the salt scent of the ocean mixed with the sweetness of blooming plants. You've done a wonderful job, she said, touching a pink blossom gently. Better than I could have done myself. That's not true. Isaiah set down the spray bottle. You taught me everything. Mrs. Thompson smiled. Sometimes teaching is just showing someone what they already know in their heart. The sliding door opened again as Rebecca emerged with 3 cups of hot chocolate, a morning ritual they developed over the past weeks. The insurance company called, she said, handing out the cups. The final payment came through. Excellent. Mrs. Thompson settled into her chair. Now we can start planning the next phase. Isaiah perked up. Next phase? Well, I've been thinking. She glanced at Rebecca, who nodded encouragingly. This balcony has become more than just my garden. It's become our special place. And I think it's time we made it official. She reached for a folder Rebecca handed her, pulling out some papers. Isaiah, how would you like to be my official garden apprentice? With a proper title and everything. His eyes widened. Really? Really? Complete with a small salary for your work? Isaiah looked at his mom. Is that allowed? Rebecca laughed. Mrs. Thompson cleared it with me first. You can put the money in your college fund, or use it to start your own garden, Mrs. Thompson added. I notice your balcony is still quite bare. Isaiah thought about the empty space at their apartment. He'd been so busy helping here, he hadn't pushed about getting their own plants. Could we really get some for our balconies? That's the idea. Mrs. Thompson pulled out a garden center catalog. I thought we could pick them out together. Use what you've learned here to create something new. Isaiah's mind raced with possibilities. Can we get jasmine like yours? And herbs? Whatever you think will work in the space. She turned to Rebecca. Consider it a thank you for everything you've both done for me. Rebecca started to protest, but Mrs. Thompson held up a hand. Let me do this. Please. Her voice grew soft. You two have given me back so much more than just a garden. You've given me family. The word hung in the morning air, delicate as the mist Isaiah had been spraying on the plants. Mom? Isaiah's voice was barely a whisper. Are you crying? Rebecca wiped her eyes quickly. Happy tears, baby. Like the water you give the plants, helping things grow. Mrs. Thompson reached for both their hands. I've lived in this building for 30 years. Watched families come and go. After George died, I thought I'd always be just watching, never participating. And then a fire of all things. She shook her head. God does work in mysterious ways. Isaiah thought about the night of the fire, how scared he'd been. Do you ever think about what would have happened if? No, Mrs. Thompson said firmly. No use dwelling on what-ifs. Better to focus on what is. What is, Isaiah thought, looking around the balcony. What is was pretty amazing. Now, Mrs. Thompson picked up the garden catalog. Let's plan your garden. A proper apprentice needs his own space to practice. They spent the morning selecting plants, Isaiah applying everything he'd learned over the past month. He chose carefully, plants that would thrive in their conditions, that would complement each other, that would bring color and life to their balcony. You're really good at this, Rebecca said, watching him calculate sun patterns and growth space. He has a gift, Mrs. Thompson agreed. Just like George did. Around noon, Mrs. Martinez appeared with lunch, her famous Cuban sandwiches. They'd gotten used to her joining them for meals, another piece of their expanding family. Have you told them about the garden club yet? She asked Mrs. Thompson. Isaiah looked up from his sandwich. Garden club? I was waiting for the right moment, Mrs. Thompson said. The community center is starting a children's garden club. They asked if I would help teach, and Isaiah could hardly contain his excitement. And I said I'd only do it if my apprentice could assist me. Rebecca touched his arm. Only if you want a baby. No pressure. Are you kidding? Yes. He turned to Mrs. Thompson. When do we start? Next month. We'll be teaching other children how to grow things, how to care for plants. She smiled. How to pay attention to the world around them. Isaiah thought about that last part. Paying attention had become second nature to him now. He noticed everything, new buds forming, leaves that needed water, signs of growth or stress in the plants. But he noticed other things too. The way his mom hummed while she worked now. The new softness in Mrs. Thompson's face. The sense of purpose in his own heart. After lunch, they walked to the garden center to order supplies for both balconies. Isaiah held the list carefully, double-checking each item. You know, the clerk said as she rang them up, we're always looking for young people interested in plants. Maybe when you're older. Isaiah nodded seriously. I'm going to be a botanist and help people grow things. A botanist? Rebecca raised her eyebrows. This was the first she'd heard of it. Is that okay? She hugged him close. More than okay. It's perfect. On the walk home, Isaiah was quiet, thinking. Finally, he asked Mom, do you think Dad knew? Knew what, baby? That I'd be good at this. He always said I noticed things others missed. Rebecca stopped walking. Your father saw you clearly, Isaiah. He knew you had gifts. Maybe not exactly what they'd be, but he knew you'd use them to help others. Back at Mrs. Thompson's, they found her napping in her chair on the balcony, surrounded by the life they'd created together. Should we wake her? Isaiah whispered. Rebecca shook her head. Let her rest. She looks peaceful. They worked quietly, unpacking the new supplies, organizing them for both balconies. Isaiah could hardly wait to start their own garden. Mom? Remember when you said change is hard, even when it's good change? Yes. I don't think this change was hard at all. Rebecca looked at her son. Not so little anymore, becoming surer of himself every day. No, she agreed. This change was like watching a flower bloom. Natural. Beautiful. Right? Mrs. Thompson stirred in her chair, blinking awake. Oh, I didn't mean to doze off. You needed the rest, Rebecca said. Besides, Isaiah added, the plants don't mind. They're still growing. Mrs. Thompson looked around her balcony, at the flourishing plants, at the people who had become her family. Yes, she said softly. Everything is growing, isn't it? 1 year had passed since the fire. Isaiah stood on Mrs. Thompson's balcony, checking the new motion-activated sprinkler system they'd installed. His idea, to make sure no one ever fell asleep and left the plants unwatered again. Is everything set for tonight? Mrs. Thompson called from inside. Almost done. He adjusted the last sprinkler head, just making sure it's perfect. They were preparing for a special dinner. 1 year since the fire, since everything changed. The balcony had never looked more beautiful. Strings of solar lights twinkled among the lush plants, creating a magical atmosphere even in daylight. Rebecca emerged from the kitchen, wearing an apron dusted with flour. The cake's in the oven. Did you remember to water the new seedlings on our balcony before coming over? Yes, Mom. Isaiah smiled. Their own balcony had become a miniature version of Mrs. Thompson's, filled with carefully chosen plants that thrived under his care. The doorbell rang, their first guests arriving. Mrs. Martinez bustled in with a huge pot of her famous black beans. Me and more. She hugged Isaiah. How's my favorite gardener? More guests followed. Neighbors who'd been there the night of the fire, firefighters Johnson and Shun who'd kept in touch, children from the garden club Isaiah now helped teach, and finally, Marcus, his dad's best friend. Looking more like your father every day, Marcus said, pulling Isaiah into a bear hug. He'd be so proud of everything you've done. The balcony doors stood open, letting in the evening breeze. Guests moved between the apartment and the garden space, admiring the transformation. Isaiah overheard snippets of conversation. Hard to believe there was a fire here. The boy's a natural with plants. Such a lovely space. Mrs. Thompson gathered everyone's attention by tapping her glass. Thank you all for coming tonight. 1 year ago, this balcony was a place of fear and destruction. Today, she gestured at the flourishing garden. Today it's a place of life and love, thanks to my young friend Isaiah. Isaiah felt his face grow hot as people turned to look at him. But this celebration isn't just about the garden, Mrs. Thompson continued. It's about community, about paying attention to each other, about how one small action can change many lives. Rebecca squeezed Isaiah's shoulder as Mrs. Thompson went on. That night, a young boy looked out his window and saw something wrong. He could have ignored it, could have assumed someone else would handle it. Instead, he took action. She paused, wiping her eyes. In doing so, he not only saved my life, but gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Family. Firefighter Chen raised her glass. To Isaiah. Everyone echoed the toast. Isaiah buried his face in his mom's side, overwhelmed by the attention. Speech, someone called out. Isaiah looked up at his mom, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. I didn't do anything special, he began. I just saw Mrs. Thompson's balcony on fire and called for help. But he looked around at the faces watching him. But maybe that's what community means. Seeing when someone needs help and doing something about it. Mrs. Martinez wiped her eyes. Several others nodded. And now look at everything that grew from that night. Isaiah gestured at the thriving plants. Not just the garden, but friendships and family. He turned to Mrs. Thompson. You gave us so much more than just a job. You gave us belonging. Rebecca was crying now, but smiling through her tears. The garden club kids call me teacher, Isaiah continued. But really, I'm still learning. Learning that sometimes the scariest moments can lead to the best changes. Learning that family isn't just about who you're born to, but who you choose to love. He reached for both his mom's and Mrs. Thompson's hands. So thank you, all of you, for being part of our garden. The applause caught him by surprise. Mrs. Martinez rushed forward to hug him, followed by others offering congratulations and kind words. As the party continued, Isaiah slipped away to the quiet corner of the balcony where the jasmine grew. Its sweet scent reminded him of that first day replanting of new beginnings. Marcus found him there. Your dad loved gardens too, you know? He did? Oh yeah. Said they were proof that beautiful things take time and care. Marcus sat on the bench beside him. Kind of like raising a son? Isaiah thought about that as the evening went on. About growth and care, about time and transformation. Later, as guests began to leave, Firefighter Johnson pulled him aside. The department's starting a youth program, teaching kids about fire safety, community awareness. Would you be interested in helping? Isaiah's eyes lit up. Really? Really? Your story. It shows other kids that age doesn't matter when it comes to making a difference. After the last guest left, Isaiah helped clean up while Rebecca and Mrs. Thompson sat on the balcony, talking softly. "Leave the dishes," Mrs. Thompson called. "Come sit with us." Isaiah joined them, settling into his favorite spot among the plants. The ocean breeze carried salt and flower scents, a combination he'd come to associate with home. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Rebecca said. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Time has a way of healing things, but it needs help sometimes. Like a garden or a family," Isaiah added quietly. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle below. From this height, Miami Beach looked like its own garden of lights and shadows. "I have something for you," Mrs. Thompson said suddenly. She reached behind her chair and pulled out a wrapped package. Isaiah opened it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal with his name embossed on the cover. "For your garden notes," she explained. "A proper botanist needs to keep records." He ran his fingers over the smooth leather. "Thank you." "Open it." Inside, on the first page, was a photograph, Mrs. Thompson's husband George in his garden. Below it, she'd written, "To Isaiah, who proves that the most beautiful gardens grow in the heart. Love, your other grandmother." Isaiah's vision blurred with tears. "Other grandmother?" "Well," she smiled, "if you'll have me." He hugged her tight, breathing in her familiar lavender scent. "Yes. Yes, please." Rebecca watched them, her own eyes shining. "You know what your father would say about all this?" "What?" "That sometimes it takes a fire to clear the ground for new growth." Isaiah thought about that as they sat together. This family formed from chance and choice and care. Above them, stars peeked through the Miami sky, competing with the twinkling solar lights among the plants. "Mom," he said after a while. "Mrs. Thompson? Grandma." They both turned to him. "Can we plant something new tomorrow? Something we've never tried before?" Mrs. Thompson, his new grandmother, smiled. "Of course, dear. What did you have in mind?" "Something that blooms at night," he decided, "to remind us that beautiful things can start in dark moments." Rebecca kissed his head. "When did you get so wise?" "I had good teachers," he said simply. "All of you?" They stayed on the balcony late into the night, making plans for new plants, new projects, new memories. The garden around them rustled softly in the breeze, as if agreeing with their hopes for the future. And Isaiah, sitting between his mother and his new grandmother, surrounded by the life they'd grown together, felt something his father had once described: the perfect peace of being exactly where you were meant to be. Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance, witnesses to this small family's transformation. And on the balcony that had once held flames, 1,000 leaves turned their faces to the sky, reaching ever upward, growing strong in the garden of second chances.